River water used to run clear through Seattle's suburbs. Now it runs thick with secrets nobody saw coming. I'm Marcus Reed. I've spent 10 years chasing stories where red tape hides real danger, and I've noticed headlines never capture the slow-burning disasters. In this piece, you'll see the paper trail an EPA investigator followed the second the records split wide open, and the neighborhood that might vanish if the dumping never stops. The folks you'll hear from might sound different on tape, the places might look a little fuzzy, but the truth stays the same. The first nudge came from a stack of case files that got shoved in with the Green River Killer's old paperwork. Those files show cops back then waved off multiple reports of medical waste washing up in the 80s, acting like it had nothing to do with the serial killings. Source: United States v. Gary Ridgway, Court Records. At the same time, the EPA was already waving red flags. A 2014 deep dive into hazardous medical waste dumping found a 30% blind spot in the country's tracking for waste handlers, and the gap was especially wide right here in the Pacific Northwest. Source: EPA Hazardous Waste Tracking Report 2014 Regulatory Report. Then Agent Maya Torres walked in, EPA Senior Investigator, who's got a knack for untangling bureaucratic knots. Torres got handed a pile of odd waste logs that listed sealed medical containers headed for a tiny, privately run incinerator near the Green River. The paperwork was half missing, the signatures looked like they'd been dragged through mud, and the destination codes didn't match anything in the system. She lined those logs up against Seattle police memos from 1990, which remembered a 1982 look into a medical supply outfit whose waste turned up near spots later tied to the Green River Killer's known dump zones. Source: Seattle PD Internal Memos Government Document. The picture that formed was straight up unsettling. Containers labeled biohazard slipped out of the supply chain, popped up as unlabeled junk along the riverbanks, and never showed up in the EPA's hazardous waste tracker. The FBI's 2005 playbook on serial killer probes even calls medical waste dumping a low-priority clue, even though it can bury evidence or, like here, lace the whole ecosystem with poison. Source: FBI Serial Murder Investigation Guide, peer-reviewed. A later New York Times deep dive found medical gloves and vials tossed near crime scenes never got DNA tests, even though one waste handler kept popping up in the chain of custody. Source: NYT Investigation, Investigative Journalism. Torres realized the missing waste wasn't just sloppy bookkeeping. It was a delivery system for heavy metals, germs, and chemical sludge that could seep into the river. The EPA's own numbers warned that a 30% tracking gap meant thousands of pounds of hazardous junk could slip through unseen, spoiling water supplies and threatening every creature that drinks from it. Source: EPA Hazardous Waste Tracking Report 2014 Regulatory Report. Keep the dumping going, and the river's fish already struggling from shrinking habitat would face a toxic domino effect. Folks living downstream, many of whom rely on the river for both fun and drinking water, would breathe in pathogens that can survive in medical waste for years. The damage wouldn't stop at the water's edge. It would roll outward until a once thriving watershed turned into a public health ticking time bomb. Torres cracked the case when she traced the smeared signatures on the waste logs to one handler outfit that filed for bankruptcy in 1991 and left an audit half done. That audit showed the company had rerouted 12% of its medical waste to off-site landfills without any containment, close enough to the EPA's 30% gap to suggest the whole system was rigged, not just one clumsy player. Source: EPA Hazardous Waste Tracking Report 2014 Regulatory Report. The danger is happening right now. Communities hugging the Green River are already seeing a jump in unexplained sickness, and local fishermen have watched salmon numbers plummet, a fish the river used to carry in healthy waves. EPA risk reports warn that breathing in untreated medical waste can spark bacterial outbreaks and let toxins build up through the food chain. Torres' next step was to file an emergency request for a federal freeze, forcing that incinerator to shut down until a full audit could run its course. The same evidence a court brushed aside in the Ridgway case, reports of medical waste called useless, is suddenly the thread that unravels a bigger crime against the environment. Source: United States v. Gary Ridgway, Court Records. What comes next won't just rewrite a cold case file, it'll expose a live environmental disaster if the waste keeps pouring in. The EPA's probe, once stuck in spreadsheets, now faces a river that could turn into a full-blown health emergency if the dumping isn't stopped cold. Stick around as we tail Agent Torres through password-locked databases, call out the companies that bank on silence, and listen to families already feeling the invisible creep of contamination. This isn't just about a river, it's about the quiet price we pay when we look the other way on the stuff we toss away. Back in '82, a Washington state medical supply firm turned in a waste manifest that listed 12 tons of biohazardous material slated for disposal. Fast forward to 1990, and Seattle police detectives were already tying that same firm's tossed away gloves and vials to crime scenes linked to the Green River killer. Yet that connection never showed up in any official paperwork. Manifest logs are meant to be the backbone of waste tracking, covering each shipment, each destination, each signature. However, a 2014 EPA regulatory report flagged a 30% gap in the system's tracking, particularly across the Pacific Northwest. That gap wasn't merely a paperwork hiccup. It acted as a blind spot that let violations slip by for years. Take a look at the Green River Killer case files. They reveal that, as early as the 80s, law enforcement brushed off reports of medical waste washing up on shores, deeming them unrelated to the serial killings. A New York Times investigation uncovered that discarded medical gloves found near crime scenes never got DNA testing, even though they were linked to a single waste handler. EPA's own files lay out a pattern. Waste handlers ran for years with incomplete or outright falsified records, while regulators simply didn't have the tools to catch them. One whistleblower, a former EPA investigator, said it straight: the system was designed to fail. Their probe uncovered a decade of neglect manifests that vanished, disposal sites never inspected, and waste that just disappeared. Even the FBI's 2005 Guide on Serial Murder Investigations warns that medical waste dumping often gets overlooked, a tidbit buried in a footnote. Still, the evidence was right there. Seattle PD internal memos from 1990 cite a 1982 probe into a medical supply firm whose waste was discovered near disposal sites tied to the Green River killer. The problem wasn't limited to a single company or a single year. It was systemic, plain and simple. The EPA report found that regional waste handlers routinely underreported volumes, mislabeled materials, and simply bypassed disposal sites. Regulators simply didn't have the resources to audit every manifest, and when violations did surface, the penalties were minimal, hardly more than a slap on the wrist. The result: a whole decade of unchecked waste dumping, with medical waste ending up in spots it never should have been. The EPA investigator who finally pieced it together never uncovered a smoking gun. Instead, they spotted a pattern, one that had been hiding in plain sight for years. As soon as the EPA investigator stepped into the warehouse, the air hung heavy with disinfectant fumes and a far stinkier, rotten odor. "You've been dumping medical waste straight into the river for years," she snapped, her voice shaking with barely held anger. The handler, a gaunt guy in a grubby lab coat, kept his eyes on the floor before muttering, "It's just trash. The river takes it." He'd served as the go-to guy for a regional waste tracking network that, the 2014 EPA Hazardous Waste Report shows, left a 30% gap in tracking handlers across the Pacific Northwest. Source: the investigator leaned in, saying, "Your logs list shipments labeled biohazard that never left the depot." He gave a lazy shrug and replied, "Paperwork's a mess." She brought up a satellite overlay that traced a chain of unmarked sites clinging to the river corridor, each a dark blot on the map, each silently bearing witness to the EPA's blind spot. Those hidden dumps stretched from Seattle's industrial fringe all the way down to the sleepy rural banks where the Green River slows to a crawl. "These are the spots where the river turned brown in the late 80s, she warned, gesturing at a red line that traced the exact stretch where the infamous Green River killer's victims were discovered. That link wasn't just speculation. Court records from United States v. Gary Ridgway reveal that law enforcement dismissed multiple reports of medical waste washing ashore in the 1980s as unrelated to the serial killings. Source: the same waste, gloves, syringes, vials, show up in Seattle Police Department internal memos from 1990, which cite a 1982 probe into a medical supply firm whose waste was discovered near the very dump sites now laid bare. Source: a New York Times probe later found that those discarded gloves and vials recovered near crime scenes were never tested for DNA, even though they were tied to a single waste handler who owned the warehouse. Source: that oversight wasn't a one-off. The FBI's 2005 Serial Murder Guide warns that medical waste dumping is often ignored as a forensic clue. Source: the investigators' showdown exposed a cascade of missed chances. First, the EPA's own tracking slip let the handlers slip under the radar. Second, police memos flagged the dump sites yet never bumped them up to a joint task force. Third, prosecutors brushed off the waste reports, calling them irrelevant trash. Each layer of negligence fed the river's contamination and, even creepier, hid a possible trail of evidence that might have narrowed the Green River killer's victim list. When the camera lingered over the polluted water, the narrator's voice cut in. The river carried bodies, but it also carried the truth that agencies chose to drown in paperwork. The climax hits hard. When bureaucratic blind spots line up, the price isn't just chemicals, it's lives left unsolved. The rivers, when something special fish runs, now sputter like a flickering bulb under a pile of used needles and rubber gloves, a grim reminder that trash doesn't just take up space. It can snuff out life faster than any animal ever could. Back in 2014, the big federal cleanup crew found they weren't even close to keeping tabs on all the dangerous medical junk, with a 30% blind spot in the Pacific Northwest that left creeks wide open for mystery dumping source. Flip back to the 80s and you'll find cops back then shrugged off a bunch of medical waste sightings along the Green River, deciding they didn't have squat to do with the string of killings that terrorized the town's source. What's wild? Those same needles and gloves never saw a lab, no DNA swab, nothing, even after the New York Times dug up a link to one sloppy waste handler source. Seattle's finest dug up memos from '90 that mentioned an '82 probe into a medical supply outfit whose trash kept turning up near known dump zones. Like the company was stuck in a loop of cutting corners no matter who was catching bodies. Source. The FBI, way back in 2005, basically said, hey, don't sleep on medical waste as evidence because too many teams treat it like background noise instead of a potential goldmine source. Time to plug the leak's real-time logs, zero wiggle room for crooked handlers, and consequences that actually stick when someone skips the rules. Towns deserve plain-sight audits, and lawmakers gotta pony up cash for watchdogs who can eyeball every barrel before it kisses the river. If you still give a rip about what's left in that water, back the crews that chase down hazardous waste and holler for rules that matter, not just words on paper. Hit share, ring your reps, and make it loud. No more sneaky pollution sliding past